A big welcome to everyone. This is the second of our distinction advice sessions. Mick kindly said he would do another one. And obviously from the number of people who booked, around 100 people booked to come, or to some of them to see the recording afterwards, it was obviously appreciated. I'm not going to say a lot more. I put into the chat if you want a question, and that was the idea, that you'd have the chance to ask questions, pop it in the chat, and if it's something that needs answering by Mick because it's relevant for that moment, then I'll do it. Otherwise we'll wait until the end. Otherwise, I think the only thing I've got to do is to welcome Mick and to say thank you very much, and pass over to him.
Thank you, Anne. Well, good afternoon and evening to everybody. Welcome to this talk. It is, as Anne said, the second time I've done this, and I do know that one or two people were wondering whether it's just a repeat of the last one. Well, obviously, because it's talking about the same subject, it's going to be very similar, but it is new. I've put in some new images, some new work, and there's some other new information. Those of you who took part in the first one and are very observant will see one or two images that are the same, because they were just very useful images for me to use. But generally, it's a new talk with the same emphasis on gaining a distinction in natural history. Now, I'm just going to share my screen. Right, I'll just check with Anne. Has that come up, Anne?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, lovely. So as I say, this is a talk about gaining distinctions, RPS distinctions in natural history, and we'll concentrate on the associate, but we will be talking about others as well. Yeah, natural history and gaining a distinction. And as I say, there's some new information, quite a lot of new information, some new images. Pretty much until we get right to the end, all the images are mine. So if I'm being super critical about images, I'm not being critical about somebody else's work. I've chosen images of my own that I hope will illustrate points I want to make. Many of you will understand the process, be involved in the process. Perhaps some of you have come through part of the process, but just for those people who haven't, there will obviously be one or two elements of sort of going through the basics. And the first one is just talking about the three levels of distinction that you can get through the RPS. The first is licentiate, that's the lowest level. The middle one is the associate, and then the highest award is the fellowship. Now we're only talking about associate and fellowship because they are the two where they become subject or genre specific, and you would apply for natural history or fine art or landscape or whatever. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So what are the first steps? Well, I think really the first step is to get onto the RPS website, and particularly up at the top, go into the qualifications area, because there's an awful lot of information here that will guide you in those first steps. When you open up the qualifications page, immediately you will see the three levels of distinctions, and obviously you choose the one that you are thinking of going for. And in this instance, we'll start by looking at the associate. So when you go into the associate section, you will see that there's a general set of criteria for all associate genres. This isn't just for the natural history one, it's for all genres, and it tells you exactly what it is we're looking for, what you've got to submit, and how you go about it. Now, I'm not going to read every word out, but there are important things here. You've got to provide a statement of intent, and we'll be talking about that. You've got to provide a body of work that communicates your vision and understanding. And it's got to show a high level of technical ability. And we do mean high level at this point. Below that, we've got the genres, and we're looking obviously at number 6, the natural history genre. Now, I'll be honest, I don't think the wording here is quite accurate for what we're looking for, because it talks about photography which illustrates an element of the natural world within an unrestricted, uncultivated and untamed environment. Now, to be honest, there's very little in this world that is totally untamed. There's an awful lot that's cultivated, but the important words there, I think, are unrestricted. And in a second, we will be looking at the definitions of natural history photography, and it will make that a little bit more clear. But don't worry about uncultivated and untamed at this point. Now, there's lots of resources on the website, and this is important that you spend time looking at these resources. There's things like a basic guide on how to apply. You've got the genre definitions, and as we've gone into the ARPS section, you've got the ARPS guidelines here. But there's other things there as well. You can see on the second row, you've got online portfolio reviews, statement of intent reviews, templates for doing your presentation layouts and so on. And these are all very useful pieces of resources that you can make the most of. And we'll be talking about some of those as the talk progresses. Also, you will find some extra information. You will find information about the people who are on the assessment panels, and you will also find the assessment dates. We've got a natural history one coming up in the middle of this month. After that, that one is fully booked, but after that, the next one will be sometime in the spring. You can book to join and watch the assessment, and you can do that for this coming September through the Observer tickets. And obviously at the moment we're doing everything online because of COVID, so you can sit at home and actually watch the assessment and learn quite a lot from that. So that's quite useful. So there's a lot of information on the website, and it certainly pays dividends spending some time reviewing it before you get too involved in putting your panel together. So let's have a quick look at the natural history sort of criteria and so on. Again, I'm not going to read all through this, but you will see there's an additional category requirements, and 2 lines I want to read out. Subjects are to be free and unrestricted in their natural or adopted habitat. Now, I think that's much more useful because, of course, there's an awful lot of wildlife that cohabits alongside human beings. And we're not restricting people from photographing animals that do that, of course, but they are to be free and unrestricted. So the zoos and wildlife parks are not what we're looking at. And subjects are to be untamed, in other words, not pets, even if we're talking about a wild animal that is kept as a pet, that would not be suitable, and uncultivated. So garden flowers would not be considered suitable for natural history. There's a lot of information here. It talks about third-party setups and whether you can use those. You can use up to 4 images in an associate panel. We'll talk about that. Further down, there's some more guidelines, and it's an element there that is worth mentioning is that it's desirable for the images in the submission to reflect the photographer's own work and effort. We're very keen that photographers submitting to the natural history are really using their own field craft and their own work rather than the setups that are available. It's not to say that you can't use them, but we're trying to encourage much more photography done off your own bat, as it were. Lots of ideas on submissions concepts, natural behaviour, life cycle, a single species, the flora and fauna of a place, be it home and abroad. And there's a little bit there at the bottom about single species panels, because we got to talk about this idea of avoiding a repetitive element to the submission. So with a single species submission, we really are looking for quite a lot of variety in image types. So looking at behaviors, life cycles, environmental images. So there's a lot of information there, which is well worth spending a bit more time reading through and considering. But obviously you've got to ask yourself, what is your panel going to be about? And there are a number of things. It could be that once in a lifetime trip to somewhere, and this is quite popular, but be aware, of course, that if that is what you do, and then you're not successful in your first attempt at your assessment, and you are advised to replace images, and you've actually not got that many more images from your once in a lifetime trip, you're not going to be able to go back and get them again. So it's perhaps worth thinking about other things, but once in a lifetime trips, going to Arctic Norway, where you have lots of opportunities, maybe boat trips to go out onto fields, these can work. But as I say, bear in mind the fact that if you don't get enough images, you could get yourself into difficulties. So maybe you want to think about something a bit more local. Go to your local nature reserve and record the wildlife that you find there. And the advantage of this, of course, is that if when you start to put your panel together, you think, that image isn't quite up to what I'm looking for, or you're looking for a slightly different subject, it's much easier to go back and try again and to try and get new images. So
Mick, could I just interrupt? Mick, could I interrupt you a moment?
Yeah.
Your sound is breaking up a little.
Yeah,
I wonder
certainly.
if you turn off your video. Would that help?
It probably would. Hang on. Yeah, let's see if I can do that. Where's can't pull up because I'm sharing a screen. I don't seem to be able to pull up my video. That's interesting. I'll just come out of this for a minute and see if I can pull up my video.
I've just stopped it, mate.
Oh, have you? That's brilliant.
Anyway.
Okay, right. Let's get back and I'll talk a little bit slower and see whether that helps. But I do apologise. I live out in the wilds of Dumfries and Galloway, and the internet at the moment is not brilliant out here. Anyway, yes, I was talking about panels done locally. Now, this was my associate panel, and yes, it was done abroad, but it wasn't a once in a lifetime trip. I made 3 or 4 trips, both summer and winter, to northern Scandinavia in order to build up the images that I was after. And I'll be talking about my panel layout in a little while. You need a statement of intent. And this needs to define what your panel is about. And your statement of intent is assessed. It is part of the criteria. And we ask for you to tell us what the aims and objectives of your panel are. And this is important because we need to look at the panel and to see whether you have actually accomplished those aims and objectives. And occasionally people write a statement of intent which doesn't really clearly give us the aims and objectives. Now, Mick Bowman has kindly permitted me to use his statement of intent to illustrate what I'm talking about here. He says, the aim of my panel is to illustrate some of the mammals, seabirds and woodland birds found in the east of England, hoping that these will help more people to enjoy the nature on our doorstep. So straight away, he's used the words, the aim of my panel is. And we can measure, we can decide whether he has actually fulfilled that aim. He then goes on to talk about, I've found out with nature photography that you get the best results by getting to know your local area. So this is a little bit of description, which is absolutely fine. But he finishes, my objective was to capture images of 15 different species in their natural habitat and to reveal their behavior. So he's given us the aim and he's given us his objectives. And we can look at his panel. Has he included 15 different species? Are they in their natural habitat? And do they reveal elements of their behavior? And if they do, then he's fulfilled the criteria. So that's a really good statement of intent. A little bit of description in the middle, but we have those aims and objectives clearly set out. Looking back quickly again at the associate criteria, it says you should clearly meet the aims and objectives outlined in your statement of intent, which is what I was talking about. You should have a consistent photographic style and that illustrates mood and emotion as appropriate. It should show your originality of approach and the photographer's input. Again, this is sort of shying away from third-party setups towards your own work. And a high standard of presentation is expected. And we're looking at a high level of understanding of composition, lighting, viewpoints, all with a visual balance and a style appropriate to the subject. So we're looking for quite a lot here, and it's up to you to look at your panel and decide whether you are meeting these criteria. So what does make a good image? Now, we do state that we're judging to these criteria, but inevitably there is going to be an element of subjective judging as well. We're not saying what is the sum of 2 plus 2, and if you say 4, you're right, and if you say anything else, you're wrong. We're looking at images, and like any art form, there is a subjective side to it, but we do try to be objective and judge to criteria as well. So, technical skills, what are we looking for here? We're looking for good handling of light, choosing an appropriate exposure level. We're looking at a considered use of shutter speed, appropriate to the subject and what you're trying to illustrate within your images. We're looking at good focusing techniques. We are asking for images to be sharp where they ought to be sharp. We're not necessarily saying every facet of the image has to be sharp, but we are looking for sharpness where it ought to be. And we're looking for appropriate use of depth of field. So how does this equate to images? Well, this image of a wind chat, when you look at it, it's a little bit, the whites are a little bit blown out. And this is a result of perhaps getting your exposure wrong. Might be something that would need to be sorted out in the field, or it might be that with just a little toning down, and I hope you can see the difference there. I've gone back to the original and now forward. With a little bit of post-processing, you can bring feather detail back into the whites. And it's looking at little details like that that's important. Here, we've got a picture that is too dark. We've got large black areas of the badger's legs, and they're pretty much completely blocked out, and we can't see any detail. So again, this is the other end of the spectrum, and we would need to see a little bit more detail in the dark areas of the badger. Maybe not in the surrounding area where you're trying to emphasize that it's at night. It's a balance. So shutter speed. Well, birds in flight, we're not always going to get every element of the bird in flight sharp, and we don't ask for that. Wing movement is quite often very useful. A little bit of blurring in the wings to show speed of the bird. But obviously this image, the shutter speed just was not fast enough because really there's nothing there that is sharp enough. So images like that would not be suitable. However, you might be choosing to use a slow shutter speed deliberately. And if that's what you're doing, then that's perfectly fine. As long as you're happy with your image and what you're trying to show, then that works. But it has to be a deliberate choice. Focusing, and again, this is a little bit subjective. What bits of the subject need to be in focus? What bits of the subject doesn't matter that it's in focus? Now, the majority of this dragonfly are in focus, but the two right-hand wings, they're losing their focus just a little bit as they go out towards the wing tips. And when you balance those against the sharp ones on the left-hand side, you might say, well, unfortunately, in this image, that is just spoiling it a little bit, and the depth of field hasn't quite been sufficient to capture enough sharpness. Backgrounds, foregrounds, depth of field, they're all tied in, and depth of field here might be considered to be such that the background is now imposing too much on the image, and it's becoming too distracting. And so a shallower depth of field in this instance would have been preferable. However, in this image, I've chosen to incorporate the background as part of the image. I've put the peacock butterfly within its environment. And so I've chosen a shallow depth of field, and I think this works. The background is telling us a little bit about the story of the subject matter, and that's a deliberate choice, and it works very much better than the previous image. Now this one, here you can see I've moved around. I've got a much better depth of field for the dragonfly, and the wings are all beautifully sharp. So this image would be one that I would consider to be up to standard, whereas the previous image, I think, as I say, just fails because of that lack of focus. Not everything is what happens in the camera. Obviously, once you're back working on your images, there are things that we need to look at as well. Now, color casts are something that is quite difficult because we don't all of us see color casts. We don't all of us see them as well as other people. I've been told that as a generalization, women see color casts better than men. And I certainly find that one or two of the ladies in our camera club sort of pick up on color cast better than I do. The other problem, of course, is that with computer monitors, they can hide or enhance color casts. Now, I'm rather hoping that on your monitors, you can see that this picture of the kestrel has a slight color cast. It's supposed to be a blue sky, but there is actually a magenta cast to it. There's a sort of pinkiness to it. That can be resolved, and in a second I'm going to change the picture and you will see it change, and I hope you can see the difference. So that is with the color cast removed. I'll go back again, and that's with the color cast in place, and that's with the color cast removed. And these are things that you do need to look at, and it's quite helpful to get other people to look at your images to see what they think about the color and whether you've got any problems with your color. Noise is an issue. Now, modern cameras are coping much better with noise, and there's also software to deal with noise, but nevertheless, it does creep into our images and it can spoil them. This picture of a barn owl at a nest, and I should point out it was taken with a license, is a very noisy image, very noisy indeed. And I ran it through some software processing, and I've reduced quite a lot of the noise. But be aware, software reduces noise can also reduce quality, and it can reduce feather detail. Now, I'm hoping, whoops, where's it gone? Sorry, I can't get my cursor up onto the picture, but the some of the feather detail has disappeared. I'll just go back again. You can see there's noise in the feathers, but there's more detail. Whereas if I go to this one I lose feather detail. So for me, this image is fine for a talk, talking about the barn owls, but it doesn't meet the criteria, that my sort of standards of criteria in terms of quality, because trying to remove the noise reduces feather detail. Now, over sharpening is something that some people, I'm afraid, are guilty of. They get an image which isn't quite as sharp as they'd like, and they try and push it on their computer. And I'm afraid if it isn't sharp enough, unless you have some very specialist software, you probably are not going to turn it sharp. Now, when you over sharpen a bird, you can see that the feather detail has been, it looks wiry, and fur detail goes the same way. And also the other problem is that when you over sharpen, you enhance the noise, because it sharpens the noise, and you can see that this image is very noisy as well as being over sharpened. And with over sharpening, you do tend to get white lines around elements of your main image, like the tail feathers in this bee eater. So be aware and be careful of not over sharpening. And if an image isn't sharp enough, then discard it. Don't try and use it. Now, composition. This is something where it does get a bit more subjective. This kestrel, there are two elements of this composition which some people would comment on: the perch, which is going out of focus, and the cobweb. And I left them both in. And when I put it into our camera club competition, the judge commented on both those elements, saying that he wasn't keen on those as part of the composition. So, as I say, it is a little bit subjective. Similarly, with this one, I deliberately put the white pelican in the center just because I felt it demanded attention. And of course, the judge again said it should have been off to one side. And that brings me on to the fact that there are rules about composition, and sometimes the rules are there and you can break them effectively, but sometimes you do need to think about them, and they're there for a reason. Here's a good example. A white-tailed eagle in flight carrying a fish. Now, in this image, the white-tailed eagle is off to the right and it's not got a great deal of space to fly into. And the rule is give your subject space to move into. And as a result of this, the image feels clumsy. It isn't a comfortable image because there's too much space where the eagle has come from and not enough space where it was going. Change that and you get a much better picture. And you can, I think, see the difference. So think about the sort of rules of composition, decide whether you want to apply them. If you don't, you've got to have a good reason for doing that. And there are lots of good reasons, but be aware that they do exist and they're there because they're there for a reason, and utilize them where it's sensible to do so. Okay, image size. Now this image, it's not sharp either, it needs to be in the bin, but it was kept for this reason. This image is too big in the frame. The wing spread out is almost out of the picture. It's what a friend of mine would call a tickle touch. It's just not quite out, but it really needs some space. But the ruff's left-hand foot is disappearing out of the frame. And really, this is too big in the frame and it becomes an uncomfortable composition. You don't need to have your main subject huge in the frame at all times, particularly if you're doing an environmental shot, but even a sort of moody shot like this, it doesn't need to be big. The buzzard is telling its story, and yet it's quite a small portion of the image. Even smaller portion of the image is this one with the herons and the egret. But again, it works as a composition. They don't need to be large in the frame, and you don't always have to have images that fill the frame. Like this one. The detail on this butterfly is such that the temptation is to make it as big as possible to show off that detail. But butterflies are small creatures, and somehow making them very big in your image just becomes a little bit unnatural. And this is something that I would really encourage you to think about, because we do get lots of images coming up in our assessments that are just too big in the frame, and they are uncomfortably large, and panels fail because images have been cropped in too tightly. It's much better to give the butterfly some space and to create a different looking image than cropping so tightly that it becomes uncomfortably large. Hang on, there we go, missed a picture. Okay, you can put images in large in the frame. This is a big bird, this is a great grey elm, so it's natural for it to look quite big. But even in this image, the bird has got a reasonable amount of space around it to breathe in, but the image is saying this is a big bird. And then if you deliberately go in really close, then please, you need to make sure that the quality of the image can withstand the crop tight in or the zoom or however you've taken it. But it would be wrong if I'd gone in tight like this and not got sharpness from the nose right back to the ears. If we'd lost depth of field, if we'd lost sharpness in the depth of field, it just doesn't work. So if you go in tight, make sure the quality is there. Backgrounds and foregrounds, just as important as the main subject. Okay, this image. Here we have an image where really there is no background and foreground to interfere with the image. The background is completely blurred out and there is no foreground. All we are seeing is the damselfly and the perch it's on, and that really is emphasizing the detail in our subject, and we're saying to the viewer, that's what I want you to look at. There's no distracting elements. So backgrounds and foregrounds are important. Take this kingfisher, for instance. This was taken against a muddy bank, and that muddy bank looks awful. It's dark, it's got black bits in it, and it's distracting. You look at the kingfisher and then your eye immediately goes to the back and you're looking at all the cracks in the mud and so on, and it takes your eye away from the kingfisher. How much better is this picture of the kingfisher where the bank has been thrown out of focus and all we are being asked to look at is the kingfisher and the perch it's on? So much better. So it's thinking about your depth of field in terms of backgrounds and so on that's important. Now, this is an image where the perch was put in place for the kingfisher. And again, thinking about where to put the perch so that the background was far enough away to throw it out of focus. That's something to consider. Here we have a chaffinch. Okay, you could say this is an environmental shot. It's sitting in a tree, but the environment is not terribly pleasing. We've got leaves and then bits of sky showing through, and again, they are detracting. But like that peacock butterfly in the grasses, or like this shot with the hare, we can use the background and the foreground to tell the story. Now in this one, the grasses are not detracting, they are part of the story. This is where the hare is sitting and they work, they're muted, and I included them and made them sharp enough so that they were a relevant part of the image. As is the background to the pine marten. This is the environment the pine marten lives in, and again I felt that the background wasn't too distracting and created a nice backdrop for the pine marten. And this one, I've chosen to really include and make quite dominant the foreground, but exclude the background. The background has some colouring in it, which is echoing the colours of the foreground, but it's the foreground that is important. And of course, here I'm really showing the colour camouflage of the golden plover as it sits on its nest within this vegetation. So the whole thing is telling the story. Going back to an insect where we don't want any of that, we don't want anything detracting. So we choose a stalk, and the butterfly on a stalk, where we're not getting any other bits of stalk or grasses or anything getting in the way, as here as well. And it's really nice if you can get a background that complements the colours of your subject. Makes it a nice, simple and attractive image. So backgrounds and foregrounds are very important. Okay, action and portrait. There is no doubt about it that quality action images have something about them that just speak volumes. You know, that we look at an image like this and they have power, there's no doubt about it. Anything where the creature is doing something can be very powerful. But not every image needs to be an action shot. This is just as powerful. This portrait of a white-tailed eagle is just as powerful in its own way as the previous two. But there are things to consider about portraiture. Obviously, you can't get an action. This flower is not going to suddenly get up and fight its neighbour. There are static subjects, and there's absolutely no reason why these shouldn't be included in your panel. But you have to think about, how can I make them as interesting as a non-static subject? And they need some work. Similarly, fungi. They're not going to move around. So again, you've got to choose your image, choose your composition so that it has its own interest and its own qualities. But animal and bird portraiture, there are issues that you have to think about. This portrait of a male mallard duck is fairly ordinary. It's a bit mundane. It's sharp. There's no blown highlights, that's certain, but the waters are not very interesting. The lighting is a bit flat, and we are rather looking down on it rather than a nice, interesting perspective. A little bit more different, get down low, a little bit of lighting changes the portrait, and it becomes a bit more interesting. Here again, lighting is important. The colours on the water, the water being dragged along as the bird swims along. This picture as much as the pintail itself. So it's that sort of thing that we're looking for. Or again here, just choosing a part of the bird, photographing it through some vegetation just to give it a slightly different feel to it. Again, it's having a little bit of imagination about what you're doing. So how do we put a submission together? We've got four things really. Decide on your theme, write your statement of intent, start selecting your images, and work on your image layout. Well, we've talked about image themes, and I've talked about the problems of doing a once-in-a-lifetime trip and not being able to repeat pictures. So other things are quite, make it a little bit easier. However, there are things to take into account, and one of those is doing a submission of a single species. If you look in the natural history guidelines at the bottom, it says a submission regarding a single species should aim to clearly show many aspects of the species, i.e. behaviour, life cycle, environment, etc., to avoid a repetitive element to the submission. And this also goes for a panel that has a variety of things in, but maybe just too many of one species. That's just I should have put that one up because that's just showing it in a little bit more detail and you can read it better. But it also talks about fieldcraft being a principal element of the photography. But looking at single species and lack of repetition is important. And third-party pay and display setups. Now, I'm sure many of you will recognise this as an osprey taken at Rothiemurchus. And this is a pay and display setup. You go along and your whole prime object is to photograph the ospreys as they catch fish. And it's exciting and there are really good images. But of course, it's not really your own fieldcraft, it's their fieldcraft. And of course, as I said, you will recognise this as a Rothie osprey, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these images out there. So it doesn't really fit your personal vision element of the criteria. This is good fun to do, but if you can do your own thing and take your own images rather than go along to a setup where you're going to get the same sort of images as everybody else who's been there, that is preferable. This is one taken in Hungary, and again, everybody goes to try and get the red-footed falcons mating, and I did the same. But again, if you can avoid using these in your panel and look for something slightly different, maybe the same subject, but maybe doing something slightly different. Here we've got a food pass between the male and the female, and this doesn't happen all the time, and it's something that you keep your eyes open for, and maybe you come up with an image that is a little bit different from all the others that everybody else who's visited Hungary and these hides have got. So it's that personal touch. And you can't be more personal than doing your own setup. Now, this is my garden, and this was a setup I had for photographing badgers in the garden. And you can create your own setups. This looks very rough and ready, but this was the back of the setup. And this is from the front of the setup, which obviously looks quite a lot different. So these are images that nobody else is going to have taken because they're my setup, I've done it, and they're not going to be repeated by other people. Now, you might not have badgers and you might not have a big garden to work in, but you can do images like this in a small garden. This is another of my own little setups and get images like this. And it's very simple. It is literally a twig tied to a bird feeder and a small hide set up. And then instead of taking pictures of the birds at the feeder, you take them on the twig. So with a little bit of inventiveness and sort of free thinking, you can come up with all sorts of things that are very definitely your own ideas. So let's have a look at single species. Mountain hares, very popular, and you might say, well, here's an image with 3 in. Here's an image of one running in a snowstorm, so very different. Here's one in blue skies, and here's a close-up. So lots of variety, but actually not really, because all of these are mountain hares taken in the winter in the snow. And if you were to produce a panel, let's say of Scottish wildlife, and put these 4 images in, you would get criticised for repetition. We usually sort of suggest if people want to put in the same species, and they tend to be similar like this, that you don't put in more than 2. And you certainly, if you were putting in a panel of mountain hares, 4 similar ones in the snow, not doing a great deal other than sitting around, would be considered to be repetition. So doing a panel of single species isn't easy. You'll see one later on, but it isn't. It's quite a difficult thing to do. So print or digital, there are pros and cons for both. One thing about prints is that you know exactly what the quality of the images is and what the assessors look at, because you create the prints and you submit them, and you know what they look like, and you can make a decision as to whether they are what you want them to look like. The big con is that it's expensive. It adds quite a lot to the cost of taking an assessment, because you've got the cost of printing and mounting and the posting of the images. However, some people just like to work with prints and they wouldn't do anything else. But those really are the pros and cons. Digital, well, obviously the plus is that producing digital images is really cost nothing, negligible. Even sending them off to be assessed is a negligible cost. However, the big drawback is it's not easy to be certain that the assessors are going to see what you see. I talked about monitor calibration briefly when I was talking about color contrast, color casts. And of course, what you see on your monitor might not be what we see as assessors. And monitor calibration, brightness and contrast are notoriously difficult to match. So there are some issues there which obviously you need to think about. So what is involved in actually taking part, having a go? Well, you've got to create a presentation layout of some sort, be it for prints or digital images. And there are things to consider: the themes, the color balance, image orientation and size, how many images per row, and avoiding repetition. Now, you've seen this once already. This was my panel, and I'll be honest, it's not a perfect panel in terms of layout. In the center row, the second one in from the left, the owl, is a little bit of a different size and perhaps not quite so balanced. But there are things here that do work. The color balance in the bottom row seems to work, and the water aspect in the top row seems to work. So it was balanced enough, but I wouldn't say that that was the best example. This little one is a much better, little, I meant the image is a little, is a much better laid out panel. We're not talking here about image quality, that you can't see the image quality on this slide. But if you look at this, we've got 3 mammals across the top, harmonious colors. We've got water across the middle, again, harmonious colors. And then we've got some nice muted colors on the bottom row. Image 2, 6 and 12 are square images right down the center, which gives balance. We've got mammals across the top just coming down to number 6 in a T shape. Either side of that, we've got sort of water birds, and then we've got other birds below that. The photographers followed the convention of having the animals or birds looking into the panel. So the left-hand birds look right and the right-hand birds look left. It works really well. So that's a well thought out layout. Go back to the information and reread it once you've started to put your pictures together. See whether they match what you're doing, what you're supposed to be doing, and think about gaining some advice. There are various ways of which you can do that. Now, in the good old days of pre-COVID, we had advisory days. Unfortunately, generally, those are not taking place at the moment because of COVID. But what has come along is the one-to-one online portfolio reviews, and also now a statement of intent review. But the one-to-one portfolio reviews are very useful. You put them through the RPS website, and you get assigned one of the panel assessors, and you send them your provisional statement of intent, a provisional presentation layout, and some high-res images. If you're doing an ARPS, you would send all 15 that you think you're going to use, plus a few spares. You'll get a Zoom meeting like this, about 40 minutes, and the assessor will have spent time looking at your images. They will talk about your statement of intent, whether it is appropriate, whether you have got an aim and an objectives, and whether the panel matches your statement of intent. They'll look at your layout, and they will look at the images themselves, and they will discuss whether there's images that are not meeting the criteria in their opinion, and whether there are, and whether you've got very strong images, and whether you've got slightly weaker ones, and whether there's a mix match or whatever it might be, and you get a lot of help and advice. It is important to remember it is an advisory session, not an assessment, and it is only one person's opinion. So it is quite possible for that person to say, I think that this panel is of standard, and for it to fail at assessment. You do have to be aware of that. But generally, of course, you are talking to the people who are assessing these panels, and their opinions and their advice is usually very good indeed and very helpful. And then it's a matter of going for it. And on the day, the assessors, the panel consists of up to 5 assessors. Now, at ARPS and FRPS standard, all the assessors have their fellowship, and they are all experienced assessors. What happens is that your images are either put up, as these are in this image here, or displayed and projected, and your statement of intent is read out. The assessors then study the images in detail, and they make a first vote, and they vote with little cards that are either green or red. It's all done sort of on the, I can't think of the right word, but each of them doesn't see what the other people are voting. It's just the chairman who sees what they're voting, and they vote either red or green, as I said. Then the chair will ask a couple of people to stand up and comment on the panels. Now, if there's been some votes yes and some votes no, they would generally ask for a comment from a person who's voted yes and a comment from somebody who's voted no. After that, the chair may make some comments. He may or she may make a comment or two about the panel, and then there is a second vote. And it's that second vote that counts. And it could well be that following the comments, both the assessor's comments and the chair's comments, people change their mind. And it's the second vote, as I say, it counts, and then the decision is announced. If it's a successful one, your name is read out and you're congratulated. If it's not successful, then it's kept quiet, and it's just, you're just told, I'm afraid that that panel was not successful. And that's really how it works. After that, of course, we're talking primarily about fellowship, associateship set. So the next step is to think, do you want to go for a fellowship? Now, this is a big step up from the associate. Obviously, it's important that it is, because it's a much higher distinction. You've got to produce 20 or 21 images, and you've got to create a submission that demonstrates a distinctive body of work. And we aren't at this level looking for really something quite special. So it's the highest level of technical ability, and it's really a body of work that communicates an individual's vision and understanding. And at this level, you are not allowed to submit any images that have been taken in a third-party setup, because we are really looking for a person's personal work and their, as I said, their individual vision and understanding. This is probably one of the hardest questions we get. What makes a fellowship image? What is distinctive? Does it mean action? Now, talked about action as being, strong, and of course they are, but again, it doesn't have to be action. Action does allow an image to become distinctive, but it's more than just action. It's something else, and it's not easy to define. This image, perhaps, it's the lighting, it's the mood, it's just that position of the gull that just might lift it above being an ordinary shot of a gull landing to something distinctive and suitable for a panel. You'll be seeing a number of images when I'm talking about fellowship. I'm not necessarily saying that they would all be considered by all assessors to be fellowship images. It also sometimes depends on how they fit in with the panel, but I'm hopefully looking at images that perhaps meet the criteria. Not this one. Here we have a puffin. It's a good image of a puffin. Lovely background, nice environmental shot. We've got the typical beak full of sand eels. It's beautifully sharp, but it is a typical picture of a puffin. It is the sort of norm. It's nothing particularly special. I enjoyed taking it and I'm pleased with it, but it wouldn't be an image that I would put into a fellowship panel. Sticking with the theme of puffins, I would say these were all taken this summer, and the reason I'm mentioning that is that they're not something that is that difficult to do. If you go to a puffin colony and you spend time there, you will get good images of puffins. Whether you'll come away with something that's of fellowship standard is another matter. Modern cameras make flight photography so much easier. There was a time when any flight shot of a bird would be considered distinctive because it was so hard to do. I'm afraid that's not the case now. 2 or 3 hours at this puffin colony, and I've got quite a few reasonable flight shots, not all as good as this and so on, but it's still fairly commonplace. Even a shot with the puffin carrying the sand eels. This is probably an image that I would say borders that bit between associate and fellowship, but it really isn't all that distinctive. It's the sort of shot that you could easily get at a puffin colony. Now, again, this is perhaps not a fellowship shot, but it's something a bit different. I was looking around at the puffins and thinking, I've got this particular talk in mind. I was thinking, what could I take here that isn't perhaps something everybody would take? And these puffins were amongst all this sea mayweed. And the sea mayweed and the puffin seemed to me to be the whole story. This was where they were. And there was this relationship between the flower and the puffin. And I wanted to try and create that relationship in this image. You might not think it's as good an image as the puffin in flight, but it is different. It's trying to look at something a little bit different. Maybe this one, where the puffin is preening and it's got its wing up, might be considered to be a little bit different. Or again, these are flight shots, but they're very different to the standard flight shots that you've just seen, where you've got these puffins in the colony sort of reacting with each other, and maybe that just lifts it to being a little bit distinctive. Portraiture does feature in fellowships, and of course if you're doing flowers or fungi, as I said, it pretty much is portraiture, but you've got to think about, again, what makes it slightly different. Is it the environment? Is it the fact that, you know, we're getting this bird when it's snowing? Is this something a little bit different? Borderline, I would say. And this, dragonflies and damselflies, there's nothing at all wrong with this. It's lovely and sharp. There's lots of detail, but it's fairly commonplace. We're seeing lots and lots of these images. Even this one that you've seen before, which I consider to be one of my better shots. You know, technically it's really good, but again, this is the sort of thing that I would say we've seen in high quality associate panels. It might just make a fellowship panel with a lot of other even better images, and it would perhaps be considered to be a weaker image, but still up to standard. So what I'm going to do now is go through some images that, to begin with, I think meet the sort of associate standard. I won't talk about them all. Normally, I would probably put this to music, but if I was doing this to a live audience, but with my internet, I can't do that. But looking at some images, portrait of an otter, a nice portrait, background not too distracting. Similarly, deer, rutting deer in the environment, the muted colours of the bracken and the, I think that's, I'm not sure what that other stuff is, bog myrtle perhaps, but that all matches and it fits the story that you're telling. Similarly here, the deer in velvet, nice portrait, would fit nicely in a panel of Scottish wildlife images. A good portrait of a sea duck, King Ida, that would work well. Long-tailed duck, nice positioning. The whites are well held. There's detail in the black, and there's obviously nice colours in the water. Gannet in flight, as I say, flight shots not so difficult to do these days. Perfectly acceptable, very good in panels, particularly here where the whites and the blacks have been well held. Nice positioning. A simple portrait of a little owl, but a really nice complementary background. Similar story with the bee eater, that added interest that it's actually got something in its beak. Black guillemot with fish, again, a little bit of interest. It's a sort of portrait, but with the added interest. Nice muted background, which is suggesting the sea, but isn't complicating the image. Again, well handled whites and blacks. Simple portrait of a hare, but perfectly acceptable in an ARPS panel because we've got good depth of field, good detail in the fur. Similarly, a rabbit, this time again using the foreground to tell the story of it feeding amongst all the flowers, but the background itself is muted enough not to be distracting. Here we have an interesting portrait with a little bit of different light, slightly closer up. Seal in water, it's the colour of the water and the ripples and the seaweed which makes this image interesting. And that attention of the seal to the photographer, there's that personal sort of element there. Squirrels, of course, popular subject, red squirrels. We've talked about insects. Here we've got a much simpler image, interesting with the perch that the damselflies are on being bent, just gives a little bit of composition to the image. Butterflies on the plant with, again, a muted background. Another portrait, nice and simple, but the background is saying, yes, it's in grassland. We can see that they're stems, but they're muted enough not to be distracting. Here we have another picture from that little setup with the perch on the bird feeder. Portrait of the darling, and just enough of the background, the foreground in sharp to give it perspective. Slightly different image of a badger coming out at night, just enough light to see the detail, but we're not blasting it with light so that it looks unnatural. The pine marten, again, nice bit of attitude there with its paw lifted and that curve of the body and the tail just gives it a little bit of interest. Yes, the body's going out of focus. That's something that some people might decide is just perhaps the depth of field isn't quite enough. There's where your subjective viewpoint comes in. Suslick, again, in its environment, which for me works well. They live in these grasslands, and this image shows very nicely it living in its environment. So we're going to move on to some images which may or may not be up to FRPS standard. As I say, it's not easy to decide, But here we come straight in with the dragonfly, golden ring dragonfly. It's got a bee that it's eating. The dragonfly is beautifully sharp, but it's the flag iris that it's sitting on, and the iris is behind that are telling the story as well. And it all makes for an interesting composition, which perhaps has a little bit more strength than some insect images. Similarly here with the demoiselle, again, it's the background foreground. It's where the excuse me, where the demoiselle is that perhaps gives interest to the image. Technical quality, the demoiselle is beautifully sharp. It's got nice movement to it where it's laying the eggs, and the body curves. But as I say, it's the background that the environment it's in that perhaps lends it's something to it. Now here we have an image of four-spotted chaser that's newly emerged. So we've got some sort of entomological interest here, or odonatory interest, dragonfly interest here. And technically it's beautifully done. It's all sharp, nice background telling the story, but perhaps just a little bit different because it's come out of its larva and that's all still there. As is this one with the large red damselfly actually emerging. This is certainly something that's a distinctive image and would fit in an FRPS panel. What about this one? Yes or no? Do the cobwebs, does that iris leaf on the left with the water drops add or detract to the image? This might be something where this would split the vote. As might this one again, is it just a bit simple, or does the cobweb and the water droplets just lift it out of the ordinary? Three otters, obviously engaging with the photographer, all sharp, nice background. I would hope, because it's one of my favourite otter images, but I would hope that that would be considered to be a fellowship image. Here we have a pine marten. Two things that perhaps lift this a little bit. One, the fact that it's got its mouth wide open and we can see the teeth, but also the fact that it is completely clouded over by the Scottish midge, and in a panel of Scottish wildlife images, that might just lift it from being just another image of a pine marten. Similarly, a badger, is it just a simple portrait, or because of the environment it's in, and we can see its claws, is this just lifting it a little bit up, higher up the standard? And again, this one with a little bit of backlighting, just light coming through the claws, that it's just putting it where it's putting its paw down. That might just make it a little bit more than just a badger image. Here we have elk in a snowstorm, a very different sort of picture. It would have to be a panel that this fitted in nicely, but this sort of graphic image could well be seen as something a little bit different and a bit distinctive. As maybe this shot of the great grey owl coming in, just slightly high key shot, but just enough detail in the snow and just enough space around the wings. Again, the fighting sea eagles, obviously this has power to it. They are quite large in the frame, but they're big birds, so that may be okay. I framed it so that they are dominating the image, and of course that diagonal sweep of the airborne birdhorn gives power to the image. Fighting buzzards in the rain, again something slightly different and certainly distinctive. Fighting herons, not something that you do get very often, and again perhaps in a panel you might even have a panel of fighting birds, and this would fit. Here's another new image for me of some gulls feeding on some fish that were obviously just below the surface. Does the fact that you've got one gull just diving down and one gull feeding, and they're sort of interlinked, does it detract from the picture, or does it make it a stronger picture? A subjective call there. This one taken obviously at the same time. We've got 4 different birds, all doing slightly different things. 2 have got fish, 2 are coming in. They're different species. Does that just, is it still just an ordinary image, or is it slightly more unusual and therefore distinctive? Here we have 2 male ruff. This is quite an old image, but I think I would hope that you would agree that this, just the positioning of the 2 birds and the environment they're in, just lifts it away from the ordinary. Hoopoe landing. Well, we get lots of hoopoes landing, but do we always get them with a little bee? Now, I could have put that bee in, I didn't. It was there. And does that make that a little bit more distinctive? Gannet diving, an unusual view of a gannet diving from sort of the back. This will appeal to some people, maybe not others. I think you know, it's a nicely balanced image. Technically, the birds are beautifully sharp. The whites and the blacks are well held. So again, I think that would lift it up from an ARPS image to an FRPS image. And a second one of the black-winged stilts, pair bonding, and again, nice background, similar sort of comments. I've seen an image of a mallard taken through the grasses. Here's an image of a heron feeding, just about to swallow a fish, and it's taken through the muted grass. Does that spoil it? Does the fact that you can see the eye of the fish as it's going down strengthen it? Another subjective image that might split the assessors. And a similar one here. You've not got a background or a foreground that might be considered distracting. And again, is this distinctive? You've got 2 fish caught, one with absolutely speared. An unusual image. I think that's a distinctive image. And obviously an image that has done well for me, the sparrowhawk catching the coal tit. This is certainly a fellowship image. So I'm going to finish with a look at 1 or 2 successful panels, not all the images out of each panel, but some of them. Here we have an ARPS image panel, sorry, and as you can see, it's British wildlife, and we've got sort of dark nighttime or darker images along the top, and then some birds along the middle and mammals along the bottom. Nicely put together. Nice harmony in the colours and some nice images. Obviously a barn owl at night, we don't see a lot of the background, but the barn owl is beautifully sharp where it needs to be. It doesn't look noisy. We've got nice detail in the feathers, a little bit of movement in the tips of the wings, which is fine. So yeah, nice image. Now this, I think, you have to be very careful, but I suspect this is a setup image up in the Cairngorms with the osprey at the fish. As I say, that is perfectly acceptable, and it's a well done image. It's beautifully sharp, lovely background, lovely detail there. Kestrels mating, again, the background works. The perch, maybe it's a little bit ordinary. It's just a simple fence post, but you know, that can certainly be forgiven, and the birds themselves are beautifully caught. A gannet portrait, beautifully done this, very muted colours, but there's detail. You can see detail in all the feathers, all the whites. You're not losing it. Lovely detail in the bill, and you've got that little bit of interest with the seaweed. Then the seals on the beach, big creatures, they've been given pride of place in the image, but there's still enough space around them. And this badger climbing up, again, enough space around the badger just to give it some room to maneuver. Now this was a panel that I think was assessed last time, and was a very pleasing panel of sort of Arctic and Antarctic wildlife. Beautifully arranged, lovely balance of images, and the images themselves were really well done. Polar bear coming out of the water, everything sharp and in beautiful focus, lovely colours. Here we have something slightly unusual with the eagle and the fox, and the fact that although the fox is being driven off, it's turned to face the eagle, so you've got that interaction, really well done. Here's an environmental image of, I think, the hooper swans flying down a field or something. That lovely mooding sky, that works really well. Now, here's an image where you don't really know where your eye is going to go, and that sometimes can be seen as a fault. But of course, in a colony like this, that's exactly how you would be. You're just completely gobsmacked by the whole thing, and you're looking around the whole time, and there's no other way of portraying it. That's been beautifully done and included in the panel. And finally, I think an ARPS panel of insects, and again, some beautiful insects here, very strong panel. Look at the detail and the light quality and the background in these images. Something slightly different with the damselfly looking around the leaf. Beautiful coloration here, lovely positioning, and just beautiful quality. Everything sharp that needs to be. And we move on to an FRPS, and this is a really interesting one because not only is it mono, but it's a single species panel of lions. And yeah, it was a brave decision by the candidates, but it worked well. Beautiful quality in the imagery. This is obviously somebody who's not just done a once in a lifetime trip, but has spent many visits, spending a lot of time getting to know lions in the environment, learning how to anticipate shots and getting good shots. You know, this is just wonderful. All three looking straight down at you. Beautiful feet positioning and lovely detail in the fur. And this one, so similar in a way, with one coming towards you, but it's raining, and it's a really rainy effect to this, which just adds to the whole story. An R shot, if you like, but it's been beautifully done. A cub washing itself and adding another element to the panel to make sure that it's not repetitive. And of course, lion shots wouldn't be lion shots without a look at them hunting and prey. This is an interesting one with the prey being dragged through the sand and it blowing up, so that you've got that slight softening effect, but you've got that the vegetation at the background, which is so typical of where lions are found. So it's telling a really whole story here. And this one, a real close up, and I talked about the fact that if you go in really close, the detail has got to be there. The detail on, that is a giraffe, and the lioness is stunning, really good quality. And similarly, an insect panel at FRPS standard. And again, the quality is here. What makes this image is the fact that you have a mating pair with a third damselfly in the image, which is very unusual and just lifts it to that distinctive level. And this one, it's just beautiful, the way in which that caterpillar is just working its way out to drop down onto the second leaf, and the quality there is just absolutely first class. And here, a bee caught in flight, beautifully caught in flight, almost everything sharp, but enough movement just to show that it is in flight. And this one again, two insect, a dragonfly and a butterfly caught together, and both of them absolutely in focus. Very, very good work. And this one, of course, it's the poppy just opening out, early morning, that makes this image. And that brings us to the end, and I will stop sharing if I can, close that down and open my video.
Okay, Mick, I've got quite a lot of questions, so I fear
I'm sure there are lots of questions, so yeah. we're doing all right for time, so hopefully
Yep. Okay, I'll start with the beginning ones. If you've still got questions, just shove them into the chat and we'll go on to those later. So are images photographed in your own garden or a botanical garden where the environment is cultivated allowed?
I would say yes, they are, because what I was saying at the beginning was that wildlife and humans coexist, and there's no way that wildlife can be separated from the human environment. So yeah, an image of a butterfly on a cultivated flower, as long as it's the butterfly that we're looking at, that would be acceptable. It's that talking of the fact that they coexist that's important. We can't get away from the fact that wildlife lives in an environment created by humans. So yes, the answer is that they would be acceptable.
Okay, and somebody's asked you to confirm that you don't need the whole subject in the image. I imagine we've looked at quite a few examples, but you might like to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely, you don't need the whole subject, but there has to be a valid reason why bits are missing. It's no good saying, you know, if you've just clipped the tip of a wing, that would be considered an error, if you like. But if you've gone in close to show the face, or the face and a paw, or something like that, and you've done it deliberately, that's absolutely acceptable. It's where you've just missed a bit out through bad composition or bad positioning of the camera, that would not be acceptable.
Okay. Somebody asked whether a panel of, I think he was talking of British hoverflies, for instance, or something like micro moths, or a very limited subject, be considered too repetitious. How would you get the variety? Yeah,
it's difficult. Obviously, there is no reason why you shouldn't do something like that, but then there has to be a little bit of thought goes into how you portray them. So, you know, are you able to get some of them in flight? Are you able to get some of them mating? Are you able to get them feeding? You could go in close and show some tiny detail of some of them. So there is ways of making it varied and not repetitious, even if your subject matter is fairly tightly limited. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think, Mick, that you mentioned that they still need a list of species, don't they?
No, it was there. I didn't actually mention that, no, but we do ask that people try at least to give some element of identification of their species, and we ask for a list of those. Sometimes it would be very difficult to come up with the exact species, but a family class would be appropriate in that instance.
Okay. One that I was quite interested in when does a setup, it's like say you're doing in your garden for the badgers, when does that become a cultivated environment?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I obviously with my badgers, the badgers were free to come and go, and they didn't have to come into my garden. They'd already started to come into my garden. I had created a setup. I put some logs down, and so that it would look a little bit more natural. It's a grey area, certainly. It's a difficult one because the little twig on the bird feeder, you might consider that a bird feeder is an unnatural setup. But of course, we're feeding birds the whole time. What we are looking for is people who sort of, in a way, use their imagination to come up with images that look natural, even if they've had to adapt certain environments in order to do that. But you do get images where the setup just really does look like a cut stump stuck in the ground and isn't natural looking. And it's avoiding things like that that's important.
Okay. Many images show a single species. And somebody asked, what's the view about images showing the interaction between two species, e.g. a big cat on the kill? Well, I think you have covered that. But
yeah, I think obviously that when you're talking about a single species, their life cycle is quite likely to involve other species. So that, there will be other species coming into it. I mean, if it was a life cycle of a bird, the sparrowhawk, for instance, you've got to show pictures of it catching other birds and things. So you would have more than one species within the image, but the story is about the single species.
Okay. Are images taken at reserves, such as the WWT or RSPB, admissible?
Yes. These are places where you can go where, yes, they've put in hides and things, but you go not really necessarily knowing what's going to be around, and you use your own skills of observation and field craft in order to get the pictures, and different things can turn up and you need to be watching and so on. So those are acceptable. The setup things are, for instance, a diving kingfisher, where you go to a hide specifically to photograph diving kingfisher, and it's set up so the kingfisher will come and dive in front of your camera. And that's very different to going to a public hide and photographing whatever comes along.
Is there a limit to the number of submissions if you fail?
No, there aren't. Although it does get very expensive. So what I would say is that if you do fail, at the end, you will be sent a letter with information about why the assessors felt it didn't reach the required standard. And obviously that hopefully is very helpful. And I would suggest that if you have failed, you spend time reviewing that, going back, maybe getting another one-to-one, and hopefully learning enough about your panel so that the second time around you have a strong panel and that it doesn't fail. It would be a mistake just to constantly do your own thing without gaining advice and keep failing as a result of it.
Now, are images taken from a safari vehicle, e.g. on an African game reserve, permissible?
This is a tricky one. Of course, that FRPS panel was done like that. There are places where photography can only be done like that. I mean, you can't drive around most African game parks on your own. That one was successful because the candidate had obviously spent a lot of time there and had spent time watching and picking the moment that they were looking for to get images, and they were putting their own skills and knowledge into it. So yes, game parks like that are allowed. What I would say is that if your panel just has images that look like they are just shots that the ranger has said, okay, here's a giraffe, take a picture of that, and here's an elephant, take a picture of that. It might not have the sort of quality and interest that we're looking at, but generally, yes, game parks are allowed, because again, it's not a single setup. You might, the warden, the ranger might take you to where there's a lion kill, but it's up to you to choose what bits of the lion activity you photograph and so on.
Are technical details such as camera, lighting, location, etc. required, or is it just the image?
No, we obviously want to see quality of skill, but we don't ask people to provide that sort of information. We look at the image as a whole. We don't go into EXIF detail. We just look at the image and decide, does it meet the criteria? And if that's the technical side of things, we're looking at, do we think that the depth of field is suitable? We're not saying, oh, it was an f5.6, it should have been an f8. We're just looking at the image and what that is portraying.
Okay. Somebody says, Mick just said I could have put the B in. Is the addition of items permitted?
No, no. What we are looking for is that the truth of the image is retained. So obviously things like artifacts, camera artifacts, dust spots can be removed. The sort of work that was done on in the dark room, or adjusting contrast and color balance and things can be done, but it is not appropriate to remove or add a major element to the image.
You do permit focus stacking, don't you? Which is
Yes,
one of the
focus stacking is permitted, because what you are doing there is creating an image that we as a human being can see, because our eyes focus stack constantly and take everything in focus. Obviously, focus stacking can be done badly and it can be done well, and that needs to be thought about. A composite image, however, is something slightly different. And a composite image might be where you are taking a shot of two elements to an image and combining them to create a third image. That is slightly different to focus stacking and is not allowed, because it is adding one element, a new element into an image.
Okay. Someone says, this is Andy, who says, just a thought, and I do hope it's acceptable to say this. You said that set up hide shots, such as Ross Motion, are limited to 4 entries, as you want the authors to use their own field skills. How does 15 images of lions from Africa fit with this? Many of these are safaris where your field skills come from the rangers, not the authors. Just a thought, as I said. I think you've just answered it in a way.
I've answered that obviously you can't get out and photograph these things without the use of rangers and vehicles, and then it's up to the photographer how they actually make use of that setting, and hopefully a photographer will do their own thing rather than just point the camera at whatever it is the ranger is showing them.
Yeah. Somebody would like you to be frank about whether you think it's more beneficial to submit work online or by prints, well, digital or print.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't know whether they're saying beneficial, meaning is one easier than the other, and does one succeed more than the other? Because the answer is no, they don't. They both succeed if they're up to standard, and they don't succeed if they're not. As I said quite early on, the benefit of submitting a print is that you know exactly what you're submitting and what is being seen by the assessors. Whereas if you do digital, you have all the issues of color balancing on your monitor and so on. So if you are concerned about what the assessor is seeing, then it may be that the print route is the way you want to go, but there is no benefit in terms of pass or failure rate.
And so somebody actually follows that by saying, what proportion of submissions get through at A and F level? And has this changed over time? I think.
I don't have specific figures on that. I certainly couldn't say about over time. We get assessments where we get a lot of fails and a few passes, and we get assessments the other way. It really doesn't seem to run to a single pattern. But as I say, we do assess each panel in its own right. So if every panel passed, that would be fine. But we would assess each individual panel as it goes.
Okay. Somebody asked, and I'm not sure if quite what they're asking, is a composite image allowed showing flight, etc.? I don't know whether they mean, you know, two images on the same mount or within the same image. Because
I know what they mean, and I've certainly done these where I've put 3 or 4 pictures of a burst of images in. Do you know, I don't think we've ever assessed an image like that. It is a composite image. I think it would very much depend on what your statement of intent was saying. My feeling is that I would try and avoid it because it's difficult to define a composite image as opposed to an image where you've included 2 different elements, because it would be difficult for us to know, for instance, whether it was the same bird in flight or whether it was 2 different birds. So it's a tricky one, that, but it's perhaps something I would avoid if possible.
there have been panels where people have shown a life cycle within of one species within the single image, hasn't it? Made up of 3 separate images. Yes. I wondered if that was the same thing.
Showing something very specific and that would be perhaps something that they would explain in their statement of intent, that they wanted to do that. Yeah.
You perhaps do the same. Are panels of excellent images but of mundane or common UK species at a disadvantage, you know, to overseas ones? Or
no, not at all. I would say, you know, maybe a mallard could be considered mundane or common, but we've seen some stunning pictures of mallards. It's on the quality of the image, not the species themselves. No. Okay. So, yeah.
Colin actually asked if diptychs and triptychs are acceptable, so I think the answer is yes. So yes, for that one. And then I think this is probably the last one. What limits are there on the use of the patch tool? You know, you were talking about removing dust spots when.
It's difficult to set a limit on the use of the patch tool. I mean, if you've got a lovely picture but you've got an incredibly dirty sensor, you're probably going to be using it quite a lot. It's something that we have to rely on the photographer's integrity in this respect, and it does boil down to the photographer deciding how much or how little they do to an image. But as I say, what I would say is that as long as you retain the truth of the image, that is the key thing. So if you are removing minor elements, dust spots, flare marks, then that is acceptable. But in the end, we don't have a measuring tool for how much or how little is done other than the integrity of the individual photographer.
What about small twigs or something that come in from the edge of a...
Again, that's something that's difficult to measure. And if, you know, cropping them out works, that's one way of doing it. And maybe the removal of the tiny little bits, as long as, again, they don't spoil the overall picture. But if you were to have a big twig going across the bird and you cloned all that lot out, that would be considered to be changing the truth of the image, so would not be seen as acceptable.
Okay, I think that's probably all. I hope so. Anyway, if I've missed anyone out, otherwise there's lots of thank yous as usual. So I've been planning in between thank yous and questions. So I think we just remains to say a very big thank you, Mick. That was very helpful. You had over 60 people at one point watching. A few people have gone home early now.
Right,
so
well,
thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, and I hope people have found it useful.